Hi friends, Ozark here, and this video will probably be called Breaking Down the Atheism, Deism, Agnosticism debate. And it's prompted by this commento. Wouldn't being agnostic be not choosing an answer? It seems to me that atheism is claiming a definitive answer. So I started answering and I said, okay, let me make a video. Affirmation, negation, atheism, agnosticism, deism. The reason these sort of questions are so tricky is because people don't frame them in terms of afs and negs. If you do, it's revelatory about a lot about the arguments, and making this thing revealed a lot to me about the arguments that I hadn't even thought about really before, because I'd never done this before. So deism, when you position it as an af, God exists and underpins moral truth. Then the neg is, it is not the case that God exists. And status quo is, God doesn't exist. So if you're arguing deism as an af, then you're positioning the status quo is, God doesn't exist, and we should change that. But what that really means is, not everybody agrees that God exists, and we should change that, is what the deism af normally is trying to do. It's saying we should get everybody to agree with this. And the neg is simply saying, no, we shouldn't get, people shouldn't agree with this, and those who don't in the status quo should retain their not doing so in the status quo. They don't need to say that God doesn't exist to negate deism. You just need to say it is not the case that God exists, or it is not the case that we should agree that God exists. You can make that argument and say, you haven't made your case. God may very well exist, but you failed to establish in your case that he did, and therefore we need to default back to the status quo that he doesn't. The atheism side. If you're running it as an affirmation, it says God doesn't exist, plus moral relativism or normative philosophy justifications for morality. And then on the neg side, you'd have to argue it is not the case that God does not exist. So in the status quo, on atheism side, God exists. And af is advocating to change the status quo and say, no, God does not exist. But really, the way it is saying, not everybody agrees that God does not exist, and everybody should. And the neg is saying, no, it's not the case that everybody should agree that God does not exist. That's really what's happening. But if you want to say the argument's about whether God exists or not, then atheists, in making the affirmation, need to concede that God exists in the status quo, and it's their affirmation to change that. And the deists need to concede that God does not exist in the status quo, and it's their burden to change that. The reason this is so strange, and the reason these things sound so strange and don't work, is because normally existence is not something that gets debated. Nobody debates whether this exists, this cup of coffee exists. You might want to say, is it an illusion or something? But it's like if I hit you with a stick, if you say that stick does not exist, and I hit you with it, and you continue to insist it does not exist, and I keep hitting you with it, eventually you go, okay, fine, it exists. Which is pretty powerful evidence. So it's strange to be arguing about whether something exists, right? Agnosticism. Agnosticism is also making a definitive claim. It's either an af or an egg. All of these questions are they aren't questions in the ether. They're either being run as afs or run as negs. In other words, they're coming out of someone's mouth, either as an affirmation, I believe in God and it's correct to believe in God, or as a negation, it is incorrect to believe in God. Or, I guess you'd say it's not the case that it's correct to believe in God. That's the thing about negation, is you don't have to prove the opposite thing. In other words, if the af is I'm tall, you don't have to prove I'm short, you just have to prove I'm not tall. Same thing here. It is not the case that whatever the af says is all you got to do. What this reveals, it ought always be determined what the discursive engagement of a question is intended to do. Oh, I didn't read agnosticism yet. God's existence is an open question. That's the af. On the negative side, it would be, it is not the case that God's existence is an open question. And God either exists or does not is the status quo. So if agnosticism is run as an af, then it's saying in the status quo, God either exists or does not. But that should change, and it should be ambiguous. It should be undecided. That's what literally would be happening argumentationally. But really what's happening socially, so to speak, is they're saying a lot of people believe in God and a lot of people are atheists. But I don't take that position myself of either a deist or an atheist. And to the extent that I'm arguing with you about it, I'm advocating that you should be more like me. We should not take a position on it. That's the funny thing about agnosticism. The reason why I reject agnosticism is it doesn't do anything argumentationally. And if it does, then it's burdened by the same burdens that any other argument is. If you're an agnostic, meaning I don't like to talk about religion, I'm not going to argue about it and take any position on it, fine. You're an agnostic, but you're actually saying my position is God's existence is an open question. Well, then you need to accept that the status quo is, for most people, God either exists or does not exist. And you need to argue that needs to be changed, and we should agree with your agnostic position. And I would argue that either the atheist or the deist position is the preferable position to agnosticism, because you're determining a question. If you affirm agnosticism, you are affirming leaving the question indeterminate forever. And you're saying that's a determination enough. But it doesn't let you do anything. So presumably if you're an atheist and you're affirming the non-existence of God, then you've got some alternate explanation or some alternate heuristics that you utilize to get to things like normative ethics and or moral relativism or whatever. If you're an agnostic, then if you're trying to answer questions about morality or ethics or anything that you can't use just TI for example, positive moral obligations, if you're trying to answer those kind of questions with agnosticism, you do so in an environment where you know that any answers you have are conditional on this other unanswered question. So that's the problem with agnosticism as a determinate answer to the question, is that it means that any work you do on dependent concepts is conditional on that forever unresolved question. And as a consequence, it's just saying, I don't want to think about that shit. That's all it is. I don't know. It's just a boring thing to argue anyway. So that's why I don't like it, really. It's boring to argue. These are the sort of things that are revealed by this. It ought to always be determined what the discursive engagement of a question is intended to do. Why is God's existence or non-existence being affirmed? Does the advocate or open questionedness being affirmed? Does the advocate seek argumentational primacy? That's usually the case. That means they want to win the argument. They want the other person to agree to agree with them, basically. Or they want a third party to say, yes, you are right, you win. If so, what is the paradigm under which a third party, real or hypothetical, would judge this debate? How would we determine who wins? If you're affirming existence of something, well, its existence would seem to supervene having the affirmation at all. But that's kind of not the case here. It's a unique set of arguments. Does the advocate seek action? If so, what do they want you to do, and what are your criteria for conformity to their wishes? Do they want you to go to church? Just say no. If that's the whole point of their engaging discursively about the subject is they want you to go to church, then there's no point in engaging them discursively to win argumentational primacy, because that's not what they seek. And even if you get it, it'll be a hollow, pointless victory, because they won't agree that a third party, real or hypothetical, would judge the debate in your favor, and they don't think that's relevant anyway. They know that God is the only third party who will judge this behavior, and God sides with them and thinks you're a heathen or something like that, right? So there's no point in arguing with people who are just trying to get you to go to church or convert you or whatever. There's no point if they're trying to seek action. If they're trying to seek argumentational primacy, then you should argue with them for sure. But the question then becomes with this one, if a given app wins the argument, what happens? So, okay, let's say, atheists, you win, that you've made it clear to us, stupid people of faith, that we're just being childish in our wishful thinking and imaginations, and it's all just supernatural hooey and blah, blah, blah. So then what? What alternative do you have to present for us, for one thing, you might ask, which is humanism and evolution and stuff. Evolution doesn't make any goddamn sense, and I say that not because I'm in favor of a God created everything universe. I'm saying that because I'm negating evolution. Evolution is currently negating itself, by the way. So if you haven't been keeping up with the scientific papers and stuff about evolution, take a look. You'll see that it's collapsing all in on itself, and I am experiencing absolute glee at its collapse, because I've been saying this for a long time, and I get so many thumbs down when I make an anti-evolution video. But the fact is that mechanism, evolution doesn't have a mechanism of explanation. They just say that shit evolves. Well, how? It's not mutation. If you think it is, you're incorrect. So it's not reproductive selection. All those things that we used to think about as evolution, they concede now that those don't have much to do with anything. So there's no mechanism. Anyway, that's regardless. That's neither here nor there. That's irrelevant to the question, by the way, of God. So for people who want to provide that as an alternative evolution, it's not exclusive. So it doesn't do anything really argumentationally. However, what it does for them in terms of their narrative work is it gives them an alternate teleology that they use that is presumably more sciencey. Like, well, the reason humans are like this is because when we were evolving, we had the need to do this as a species to preserve resources or whatever. It served this purpose in our psychosocial evolution from our physio-psychosocial evolution from single cell organism all the way up to fully complex human being. That's the alternate frame that they use to explain a teleology for things. But the fact is, most stuff that we talk about like that, we don't have any meaningful explanation for it. Why is it that humans can be that? Nobody knows. There's no explanation.
Talk about something interesting now.
Okay, I'm almost at the end of this document, Kim. And then I'll stop it, the video, and upload it. Neg, what?
The F out of me.
Okay, well, Cam, you just came out here.
I know, but you've been boring me all morning with all these very boring topics.
Okay, well, let me just finish this real quick. What is the neg's relationship to the status quo? Existence is not normally the entirety of the status quo. Rather, it's a quality upon which being able to argue about something supervenes. Can you imagine arguing about whether this coffee cup exists?
It exists.
Right.
Chop, chop.
Okay, so if the af is it exists, then the neg is in the status quo it doesn't exist. It doesn't really make any sense. You'd be like, this doesn't exist, but now it does because of my af. Look, I can prove it exists. Blah, 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 blah. Then the neg is saying, no, you can't prove it exists. So that's really a different question, right? The affirmative of can I prove this cup exists and the affirmative of this cup exists are different questions. People typically argue, does God exist? Not the question of whether they can prove that God exists, which is a much more interesting question. Negating God means he does not exist in the status quo, but affirming God's non-existence means that he does exist in the status quo, and we should change that.
Eric, open the garage doors. Look outside. Look at the beauty of the clouds on the trees. How could you deny?
Kimberly, I'm almost done. I'm almost done. Will you stop, please?
When you look at the beauty,
You know what? People who are interested in this are going to be annoyed at you. And they're going to say, Kimberly, you used to be cool, but now I don't like you. Kimberly, God damn it, shut up. I'm trying to finish. All right. The key takeaways here are frames can reveal underlying architecture of arguments. So anytime you're talking about whether or not God exists, you should think, oh, maybe that's the wrong kind of question to argue about, because when you put it like this and I got to affirm or negate something, it's weird, because the status quo is going to be entirely about whether the thing we're arguing about exists, but it must exist for us to argue about it. Now, meaningfully, then, the argument is always about something other than whether God exists. It's about whether you can prove it, or whether you ought to agree with it, or something like that. And then behavior. Lastly, the answer to all these questions, and the reason it's like this, is because faith is not a affirmation, it's a behavior. And when you try to treat it like an affirmation, you run afoul of the garbled mess that results when you mistake a behavior for an affirmation and try to behave accordingly. So that's it. Before I bore Kimberly any further, thanks for watching. Evelyn, thanks for your comment. You're one of my all-time favorite commenters.
He tells everyone that.
It's not. I do not tell everybody that. Evelyn S. Evelyn S. is one of my all-time favorite commenters, not just because she sided with me about the evolution point, or at least my arguments, right? She's not siding with me about evolution necessarily. Nobody needs to side with me about evolution. Nobody needs to take a position on evolution. What I'm saying is acknowledge that the arguments that win. And, that doesn't mean anything beyond that. The fact is, an evolutionary aff cannot withstand any kind of argumentational scrutiny. And there's no such thing as an evolutionary neg. So, because the status quo is we don't have the question answered. Anyway, Evelyn was responsive to what I said, not to something else, and understood that the arguments I was making were determinate at the moment. They might be beat by some other arguments at some point, but at the moment they were determinate. And so, I appreciated that a lot, because I was getting a lot of fucking flack from a lot of people. I'm not saying believe this, believe that, this is true, this is not true. I'm saying these are the winning arguments. All right, so anyway,
You said the F word. Does that mean it won't be monetized?
You can get away with one or two of them. It's like if you say it in a way that's angry or like directed at somebody, it seems to notice that and say, yeah. Anyway, I got a link for this thing. You can look at it if you want it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to eat plenty of breeze. Plenty of breezes. Don't forget to eat plenty of breezes.